Welcome everyone. Welcome to the J. Krishnamurti and the Contemporary World Crisis Conference. My name is Ashwani Kumar. I'm a professor of education at Mount St. Vincent University and I'm the co-chair of this conference along with Dr. Nayha Acharya. Thank you for being here with us to kick off the conference. It is nice to see so many of the attendees from India and Canada, both of which are my home. I'm sure there are people from other parts of the world too, given Krishnamurti's widespread influence. Currently, we have close to 250 participants registered, which is very heartwarming. I would like to note that this conference is being hosted in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is the unceded ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people and traditionally known as Mi'kmaqi. Over my years here, I have come to learn so many things about Mi'kmaq culture from my students and community members. And I have noted many remarkable connections between Krishnamurti's ideas and Mi'kmaq culture. Many of my indigenous students have often shared that they find Krishnamurti and my approach to education closely connected to indigenous worldviews. Some common shared themes between indigenous worldviews and the work of Krishnamurti include the importance of relationships, relationship between human beings and nature, the value of listening and dialogue, the significance of spirituality, and the value of holistic education for the whole being. We will be hearing more about all of these themes from all of our presenters over the days of the conference. Krishnamurti was one of the few philosophers and spiritual teachers who considered the entire world as one unit rather than something fragmented and divided. The central focus of his philosophy is to discover the unity of life within oneself and with the world. COVID-19 pandemic has shown us our fragilities and vulnerabilities, our connection to one another, and the significance of existing together peacefully and harmoniously. This conference will help us understand our contemporary world crisis, including COVID-19, widespread racism, and various forms of conflict in light of Krishnamurti's work. You can read more about the goals of this conference and about J. Krishnamurti from the conference program. Before I turn it over to Dr. Prachi Kaul and Dr. Julie McMullin for their opening remarks, I would like to introduce my co-chair, Dr. Nayha Acharya. Dr. Acharya is a professor of law at Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University here in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Would you like to say a few words, Nayha?
Thank you. I was just muted for a second. Hello, everybody, and welcome again to everybody. Good morning again to the people over here, and good evening to everyone in India. I was so happy to be involved in the organization of this interdisciplinary and intercultural dialogue. And as Ashwani mentioned, Canada and India are both dear to me as well. And so it's so nice for us to be part of this type of coming together of both of the countries, and especially so given that we are discussing the ideas of J. Krishnamurti and their global relevance. So I think we've got a really exciting couple of weekends coming up. I really must also say that the lineup of speakers who has agreed to share their time with us over the next 2 weekends is such an exciting group. And anyone who has read the bios will surely agree. So I want to take the opportunity to thank all of our speakers so much for agreeing to take part in making this event possible for us. And of course, all the attendees, so all of you for sharing your interest in this and coming to make this event possible with us. Now, very notably, none of this would have happened without the support of the Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute, which aims to foster collaborations and relationships between Canada and India. And so again, we are so pleased to be part of that type of organization. So with that, I would like to then turn it over to Dr. Prachi Kaul, who you should see spotlighted on your screen. She is the director of the Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute, and she has kindly offered to give some opening remarks. Over to you, Prachi.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Acharya and Dr. Kumar, for this opportunity. These are not going to be opening remarks at all because I am not coming from the fraternity of academicians or educators that are there to speak about this noble soul who's named as Krishnamurti ji. So I'm here to just congratulate you and say that I was amazed with this idea that both of you have proposed to the Shastri Institute. And I think people like Krishnamurti ji are kind of a bridge that can connect two type of humanities together. And given the kind of similarity that we have between these two nations, I think a bridge like this would do wonders to bring the connections alive and make each other understand the ethos and the values that he has put forward for the human being per se. Well, I come from Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute, and I see here many known, names who have been associated with us for long. But I can say that if you're not aware of or you don't know the institute very well, it's a binational organization. We have completed our 50 years in 2018, and that was the year when we started, pursuing the membership of your especially St. Vincent University, Canada, to join the member council from the Canadian end. Of course, Nayha, you come from a member institution that is Dalhousie University, and it is there for long as a member of Shastri Institute. So I can't see Dr. McMullin here, but she was pivotal in bringing your institution, Dr. Kumar, on board of Shastri. So very warm welcome, all of you. I'm really pleased that you are part of our network of institutions. We are 155 plus, which includes more than 40 institutions from Canada side, and you name a good institution, it is on our board. Similarly, from India side, we have impressive line of institutions, and all of these institutions are producing wonderful work that is contributing on this binational corridor between India and Canada. So congratulations once again for putting this together, both of you, and bringing this impressive line of speakers. I'm sure the deliberations are going to be very, very impressive and very interesting too. Krishnamurti ji is somehow closer to my heart as well, because my both kids have gone to a school called Mirambika, which is primarily based on Shri Aurobindo's philosophy, but that also have great influence on Krishnamurti's pedagogy. And I have been associated with his schools throughout India some way. This connection brought me closer to his ethics and the values that he has presented to the whole world. So I would say best of luck to organizers and as well as to the attendees who are immensely going to be benefited by this event. I think that would be enough from my side. And this is the first grant that has gone to your university, Dr. Kumar, and I'm sure it's a wonderful beginning for Shastri to see this nurturing so well. I'm sure you will be able to take this forward for all of us together. And please convey my gratitude to the president of the university and as well as to Dr. McMullin. And I again wish you the very best for the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Prachi. We are indeed very happy to be part of the Shastri. Thank you so much for your thoughtful remarks. And I think you said it very well. It was Dr. Julie McMullin who took an interest in becoming part of Shastri Institute. So we are very happy that she is also here to share her opening remarks with us. And you as also said that Mount, this is the first time that Mount has become part of the Shastri Institute. And this is its first year. And we are very happy to have applied for this grant and have received the program development grant. So many thanks to the Shastri Institute and many thanks to Dr. McMullin. So Julie, would you like to share your opening remarks?
Sure, thank you. So good morning, everyone. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. As you can see on the screen here, my name says Tracy McKenzie, but it's actually Julie McMullin. Tracy's my wonderful assistant, and Prachi and I know each other well. We're friends, But Prachi, this is my COVID hairdo. It's not brown
Yeah,
anymore. It's
and that's,
gray.
that's what makes you appear a little different, and that's why I could not recognize you. You look smart.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So I was very privileged to take part in the 50th anniversary celebration of the Shastri Institute in India several years ago, and that's where Prachi and I first met. And I've continued to be so very impressed with the work that Shastri does in building relationships between Canada and India in the university sector primarily. So at Mount St. Vincent University, we were very pleased to join. I was a member there. I led the charge of being a member there at my previous institution, and it was just very delightful to be able to do it here at Mount St. Vincent as well. So on behalf of Mount St. Vincent University and the Dalhousie University communities, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this exciting conference that brings together Indian and Canadian thinkers to tackle contemporary global crises using the work of Jiddu Krishnamurti. I am thrilled to see the partnership between the Mount and Dalhousie in putting this conference together, and continue to look forward to connections between our two institutions, as well as our institutions and the Shastri Institute. This conference brings us together at what is a very difficult time for all of us. To this point, I see today's event not only as an example of what it means to take a globalized approach to solving our collective problems, but also as a demonstration of the value of opening ourselves to perspectives that we may not have been privy to, or remain limited by our geographical regions. I'm incredibly impressed by the range of disciplines that are represented in this conference. It demonstrates the expansiveness of Krishnamurti's ideas, as well as the value of moving beyond our individual silos and coming together collectively to discuss our shared issues. The central uniting focus of this conference is, of course, the philosophy of Jiddu Krishnamurti, a philosopher who was born in India, but whose ideas transcend geographical, limitation, and whose ideas invoke a sense of unity among human beings rather than divisiveness. It is fitting that our international and interdisciplinary exchange be centered around the ideas of such a great philosopher. Over the next couple of hours, you will have the pleasure of listening to panelists explore questions such as, what are the primary crises that face modern society, and how have they been highlighted or exacerbated by COVID-19? How might the ideas of Krishnamurti help us identify the root of our crises and conflicts, and help us identify possible responses to them? And how students educated in the Krishnamurti schools have been prepared for life, for its conflicts, its struggles, and demands. Again, I am grateful to the Shastri Institute of Canada, an organization that supports connections and partnerships between India and Canada. The Institute has played no small part in today's events, a bringing together of Canadian and Indian minds that allow for a rich and diverse exchange of ideas. I would be remiss before I close if I did not acknowledge today's organizers, Dr. Ashwani Kumar, Associate Professor of Education at Mount St. Vincent University, and Dr. Nayha Acharya, Associate Professor of the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University, where coincidentally my daughter is in second year studies at law, Dalhousie University. I'm so very sorry that my previous commitments will not allow for me to participate in any of your panels. But in closing, I would like to encourage your very active and enthusiastic participation. We have so much to learn from one another. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. McMullin, for your thoughtful comments and your very kind acknowledgement of us as well. Just a quick correction. I'm an assistant prof at Schulich, not an associate prof yet, but thank you for the promotion. So
matter of time.
I hope so, yeah. So we're now ready to get started then with the keynote panel, which I know everybody is super eager for. But I just wanted to acknowledge at the outset that the tireless work of our conference organizing committee. And so along with Ashwani and I, that includes Bonnie Peterson and Jamie Karen, who are two doctoral students at Mount St. Vincent University, and Michael Jeska, who is a student with me at the Dalhousie Law School. So you may have already seen messages or emails from these three people. So now, and you may see messages as well over the course of the conference. So now you know who they are. They are our students. We're very proud of them, and we really could not have asked for a better team to put this together. So I just want to extend right now our heartfelt thanks to Bonnie, Jamie, and Michael. Thank you, all of you. Okay, just a couple of quick things to make sure that we are running smoothly, and then we will get into the keynote. So first of all, you all will have received a full program of the conference by now. An email came out attaching it just this morning, so hopefully everybody has got it. If not, I have also included it in the chat. So if you can go to the chat on the right side of your screen, you will see the program there, and you can download it. And so please do download it in the next few minutes, because the chat will be temporarily disabled in just momentarily. Okay, so the conference program is important because it includes links to the works of Jiddu Krishnamurti, along with descriptions of each of the talks and the speakers' bios. So there's a lot of important information on there. So please do download it if you haven't received it by email. Okay, there may be a couple of messages in the chat that it's not visible right now. I will put it in the chat again later in the meeting. Okay. Okay, so that's the program. Second, the link that you were sent when you registered is the same link that can be used for every session in this conference. So the link that you use to get in today, right now, is the same link that you can use tomorrow and Sunday, and also for next weekend. So please just continue using this same link. I'm seeing a message in the chat. Are we live telecasting? No, we are not live. We are recording, but we are not live. Okay, so that's the registration link. Now, one thing that I wanted to mention also is that for those of you who are using laptops and desktop computers, I think the best view will be to select the speaker view. So you can do that while going into the top right-hand corner. On most programs, there'll be an icon that says view. Most of the time it will default to gallery view, but you can change that to speaker view. And if you do that, then you'll be able to see the speakers or the panelists highlighted on your screen. So that, I think, will give you the best viewing experience. You can go ahead and change that now. Okay, and third thing, last thing, again, I would request that you keep cameras and mics off for the duration of these sessions. That's only to minimize, of course, internet and sound disruptions. But despite the cameras and the mics being off during the sessions, we still are hoping to generate a lot of question and answer during all of the scheduled sessions. So what we are asking is that you make note of your questions as the panelists are speaking. And once the panelists have spoken, then the chat function will be enabled again. So the chat function on the right-hand side will be opened up, and you will be able to type in your questions to the chat. Everybody will be able to see those questions. So that'll be a nice way for us to engage with each other. But Ashwani and I will relay those questions to the speakers, and then the speakers can engage in them. So we thought that this would be the best way to ensure a steady and fruitful dialogue in this online conference. Okay, so those were the housekeeping things that I just wanted to take care of. And I will now spotlight the videos of the keynote panelists. So thank you again to Dr. McMullin and Dr. Kaul. They have removed themselves, and I will now highlight the keynote addressees. Thank you.
Thank you, Nayha. So now we are ready for our keynote addresses. Welcome to Dr. Meenakshi Thapan, Dr. Ravi Ravindra, and Dr. Hilary Rodrigues. Thank you so much for accepting to be a keynote speaker at the Krishnamurti conference. Just one thing that I wanted to highlight, Dr. Ravi Ravindra brought it to my attention that in the previous program drafts that we sent, the title of his talk was Listening to Krishna. He wanted it to be corrected to Listening to Krishna Ji. So we have done that. In the new program, you will see that. We are really fortunate to have these keynote speakers. Each of them have spent a lifetime exploring Krishnamurti's work. And to my knowledge, I think all of them have definitely met Krishnamurti in person. I'm lucky I have had the chance to meet them all in person. And like all the attendees, I'm really looking forward to their keynote addresses. For the attendees, if you would like to read the biographies of the keynote speakers and other presenters and want to know more about the descriptions of their talks, please review the conference program. So Dr. Thapan and Dr. Ravindra and Dr. Rodrigues, each of you will have about 20 minutes to share your thoughts. And after you have spoken, we will open the chat function so that we can relay the questions and comments of the audience to you. So I think we are ready to start our keynote panel. So Dr. Meenakshi Thapan, may I request you to go first? Please share your connection with Krishnamurti and your work on Krishnamurti and share your keynote remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ashwani Kumar. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me to this conference, both Professor Ashwani Kumar and Nayha Acharya. Thank you both. I'm very grateful to be part of this panel. I'd like to begin the title of my talk this evening is, or this morning with you, is Krishnamurti School, Culture and Learning. As Ashwani had asked me to also asked all of us perhaps to talk about our encounter with Krishnaji, I would like to begin with that. He was not known to me when I was a very young undergrad student and I met him for the first time in the winter of 1973 in Delhi. I was taken to him by my very worried parents who thought I might take off into religion in a big way, abandoning them and my life in the university. They were not wrong, but that was not to be. And I met Krishnamurti in November that year, and then spent 3 weeks in Madras, where he was going to give talks, and argued with him about organized religion, which at that time I thought was the way forward for somebody who was interested in a spiritual life. But he actually changed my understanding of the sacred and one's search for it. I have talked about this briefly in a recent article that I have written in the journal for the Krishnamurti School, so I won't repeat it here. I will only add that I did not then feel the need to run away from daily life and into a mountain retreat, but was now immersed fully in living, in understanding how one can begin to unravel oneself and one's relationship with our social world. In the almost 50 years that have followed my encounter with Krishnamurti, I have in the university and outside tried to understand his educational work, both in terms of its perspective and its practice. And what has engaged me the most has actually been his ability to identify the transformative potential. Sorry. Not merely as that which we understand as resulting in human development and economic growth, but which can also help human beings understand themselves and thereby transform social life. This quality of being able to focus on the potential of human beings, to inquire into themselves, to understand their feelings, their thoughts, their relationships, is actually at the time that Krishnamurti was speaking, and today as well, a unique way of understanding the promise that education holds out to us. While this may be more commonplace in some schools around the world today, It was certainly not the case when Krishnamurti first started addressing these concerns in the 1930s and 40s. In the current context where divisiveness, violence, and hatred seems to define human relation, his work is even more relevant. Krishnamurti has raised significant questions about the state of the world, about our tendency to remain passive beings in a state of overwhelming confusion. And it is his method that delineates an unconditioned reflective approach and emphasizes self-inquiry. That is what really appeals to me. This is what may lead to a transformation in our relationship to people, nature, objects, and ideas. He highlighted, therefore, actually, that because he said that our minds are so conditioned that we are unable to look, listen, or learn without the prior knowledge that foregrounds all our, the role of memory and time in what we are trying to do. He highlighted the need to work with young children whose minds are fresh and free from the burden of memory and already ingrained ways of acting, thinking, and feeling. So he really considered education to be the means through which teachers and children could work together. And here the school is in fact the centerpiece of his vision for psychological development and as well as educational excellence. And it is within this setting of the school that Krishnamurti hopes the seed for individual and social change will be planted and grow through a very nurturing, affectionate, and enabling environment. Now, for Krishnamurti, as we all know, the focus needs to not merely be on academic knowledge, but on knowing oneself. He often used the metaphor of a carriage drawn by two horses, where each horse is going in a different direction. One represents academic knowledge, the other psychological development. By paying attention to and overemphasizing the academic aspect alone, as we are still doing in mainstream schools in India, education is in fact incomplete. And Nayha, may I ask you to please play the first video?
Schools, from the ancient Greek to ancient India and so on, are places where you learn. Learn where there is leisure. Please go with me a little bit. One cannot learn if you have not leisure. That is time to yourself, time to listen to others, time to inquire. Such a place is a school. The modern schools all over the world are merely cultivating one part of the brain, which is the acquisition of knowledge, technologically, scientifically, biologically, archaeology, and so on. They're only concerned with the cultivation of a particular part of the brain which acquires a great deal of knowledge, outer knowledge, astrophysics, theoretical physics, architecture, engineering, and so on, surgery, medicine. So they're cultivating only, as far as one can see, knowledge. That knowledge can be used skillfully to earn a livelihood or unskillfully, depending on the person. The schools, such schools have existed for thousands of years. Here in these schools, we are trying something entirely different. You don't mind my telling you all this? Are you interested in this? Not very much, but all right. Here we're trying not only to educate academically, A-levels and O-levels and all the rest of it, but also to cultivate, to understand, to educate, to inquire into the whole psychological structure of human being. Students come already conditioned. So there begins the difficulty. One has not only to help each other to uncondition, but also to inquire much more deeply. This is what these schools with which we are connected are trying to do. They may not succeed. Probably they won't. Or probably they will. But as it is a difficult task, one must attempt it, not always follow the easiest path.
Now, the interesting thing is that Krishnaji was saying all this long before the neuroscientists started telling us that the emotional development of children was part of their cognitive development and crucial to their learning, or when social emotional learning, or SEL as we know, became fashionable in educational practice. SEL is a method, we know, that works from the outside inwards. If you see their website, they describe SEL as social and emotional competencies that can be taught, modeled, and practiced, and that lead to positive student outcomes that are important for success in school and life. So this is their statement on what they aim to do. And later, of course, last year in 2020, they modified their definition. But once again, it's the acquisition and application of personal and collective goals through, of knowledge, skills, and healthy attitudes, what they call healthy attitudes, to achieve manage one's emotions and achieve one's goals. So once again, there is the acquisition and application of knowledge, skills, and attitudes is what they're talking about. For Krishnamurti, what was important was that it was actually the self-inquiry into one's consciousness, into that which shapes our conduct. And I think for him, it is significant that he described the stream of consciousness as thought feeling. This is the guiding principle that creates possibilities for enriching and nurturing emotional learning in school education. Paying attention to emotions, recognizing them, being aware of them, dealing with them becomes an important component of pedagogy. Paying attention to thought feeling was very important to Krishnamurti. At a talk in May 1944 at the Oak Grove School, Krishnamurti suggested to his audience, as a means, I quote him, as a means to self-knowledge and right thinking, one should write down every thought feeling, the pleasant as well as the unpleasant. Thus one becomes aware of the whole content of consciousness, the private thoughts, the secret motives, intentions, and bondages. Thus, through constant self-awareness, there comes self-knowledge, which brings about right thinking. For without self-knowledge, there can be no understanding. The source of understanding is within oneself, and there is no comprehension of the world and our relationship to it without deep self-knowledge. So this was what Krishnamurti was exhorting us to do. And in fact, a teacher at the Oak Grove School, William Swart, tried this out with children at the Oak Grove School and asked them to record their thoughts. And later then, he asked them to destroy the pages and then talk about what they had felt. And while there was some frustration because they felt that one of them said, it's all about me, it's amazing how self-centered I am. And somebody else said that I have so many negative thoughts and so on. But in the end, one student also said, it provided me with the opportunity to take a step back and assess a certain situation and all of my feelings as well. It allowed me to express all my disappointment, anger, frustration, and sadness. And then after that, all of that, I could let it go. It was over and done with. The issue then became insignificant. So this was one example of how we may initiate this process of self-inquiry with children. As he said, his schools are trying to do this to help students understand themselves. And while the schools may or may not be successful, it is the process that's important. So teachers in Krishnamurti schools do not merely teach, they in fact play a very significant pastoral role in the lives of children by caring for them, nurturing them, their mental and psychological growth in many ways. And I don't have much time, but I would have liked to speak about fear and how it's one of the most debilitating factors that hinders an individual's growth and is actually the cornerstone of competitive schooling in India. And yet, how in the Krishnamurti schools, we actually try to do away with this element by developing and nurturing a teacher-student relationship where there is an open quality of interaction without fear or prejudice. And this is based on an egalitarian rapport that rests on conversations and dialogue rather than on authoritarian assertions by the teacher of the student. And dialogue is, in fact, at the core of many of such the relationships. To quote a student who studied at the Rishi Valley School, which is where I work and live now, and then he studied here and went on to study mathematics at Yale University. He's now a writer. His name is Anjan Sundaram. He says, and I quote him, "One of the distinguishing features of schools like the one I went to is the relationship between adults and children. Teachers whom I knew spoke to me and treated me as though we were at the same intellectual level. You didn't feel you were in a hierarchical world. You felt you were in a world of peers that included teachers, the principal, everyone." Such relationships are the basis of an ethos that constitutes school culture. And this is a very central part of Krishnamurti school. I would like to briefly speak about this school culture. What do I mean by this? It's not made up as we might imagine. As sociologists, I was trained to look at school culture largely in terms of the trivia of school life. As educators, we often imagine that it is that. And therefore, we pay so much attention to the detail of the routine, the schedule, the manner in which we keep children and ourselves occupied throughout the day. School culture, however, is a process. And I would like to emphasize that. So what is this process? How does this define and become the culture that prevails in an educational setting, which is not about academic scholarship alone, and one that this culture liberates even as it circumscribes? Because it is being in school is being circumscribed. I need to, sorry. I'm afraid the electricity has gone in Rishi Valley. I have to. Am I still there?
Yeah, we can hear you and see you fine.
Okay, I'm putting on the hotspot just to be on the safe side. So this school culture is in fact what is critical to being in school. And as I said, it's a process, and the being in school is in part of the school culture actually helps us to push our boundaries as teachers and as children, and enables us to understand the multi-dimensional facets of life, and simultaneously expects us to be good at that which we do. Now, Krishnamurti did not accept mediocrity as a virtue in the same way as he did not cherish the burden of memory that is embodied in knowledge, which we worship, in fact, as representative of truth. Instead, he asked us to look, to listen, and to learn, as if we were doing it for the very first time. In other words, to be fresh in our approach to learning. So there would then be not, the accumulation of learning. So I would just like to, as I have to hurry up now, I would just like to say that in activities, sports, theatre, art, actually mark a regular school day. school culture is also marked by stillness. It is the morning assembly, the evening astachal, which is when the children watch the sunset. These are the two acts that seek to instill stillness as integral parts of the everyday. By posting them in the routine, that they're interwoven into the fabric of school life, and they are part of the process of learning that constitutes schooling. Neha, may I ask you to just show the second video clip quickly?
It's a big challenge. How do you cultivate a sort of stillness? In fact, that stillness accommodates learning, enables learning. So I think restlessness is a lack of attention, and attention is both inner and outer. When your perception is cleansed, you are aware of the outer world and also of the inner world. And that's really what Krishnaji had in mind, that the inner and outer are not different.
So I would like to just say that some years ago, I had asked the class 12 students at Rishi Valley what they would miss the most when they left school, as they were going to shortly. And they were quiet, they thought for some time. Finally, one girl said, I quote her, "It's something in the air, something intangible. I can't put a name to it, but it's there. I will miss that the most." And her classmates reiterated the same. So as teachers and students, it's important actually to be attentive to this atmosphere, this ethos that Krishnamurti has brought to not only this school, to all his schools, and which has been experienced by so many others, including myself. It is in such an atmosphere that learning takes place based on trust and mutual affection. And of course, I also talk about relationship that is central to the teacher-student interaction in Krishnamurti schools. And is it, Krishnamurti often talked about, you are the world, or also to be is to be related, is another of his oft-quoted statements. The idea is not that we understand this merely intellectually, but viscerally, with a kind of conscious awareness that we can never experience ourselves only as an individual in a bounded or enclosed space, but actually that we need to stretch ourselves outside our known universe of comfort and privilege, our close circle of friends or clique of intimate friends, to understand the lives and experience of others who may be less privileged, have no access to education or livelihood opportunities, who may indeed speak a different language or have a special faith, a religious faith, a unique life story, and so on. So is it possible then to bring this expanded idea of the individual to our children in the everyday life of an educational setting? Pushing out the boundaries of the self is not unimaginable or impossible. With time, children may come to understand that it is possible to see the other, who may look different or belong to another community or caste, as being part of a larger inclusive whole in which we are all connected as a disparate but collective entity. This is possible only if we allow children to actually ask questions about issues of identity and respond to them equally honestly. Identity is not a fixed idea or experience. It is in movement. It is constantly fluid. I experience as many aspects of myself at the intersection of multiple facets of being a person, as does everyone else. The space for dialogue in everyday life requires a culture that is open to questioning, to honest conversations about ourselves and others, to explore nuances of relationship that are often unexpressed or remain outside the field of what we consider formal education per se. This once again comes down to school culture and to maintaining an ethos that is conducive to such conversations, and also to enabling a more non-violent and just social world. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for the difficulties with the electricity and so on.
Well, I think your talk was very powerful, Meenakshi, and I didn't even feel that there was any hiccup or any interruption. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and some people think that Krishnamurti has often critiqued and questioned methods, but I think sometimes people confuse it having like no contextual exploration in the class. Like for example, I do a lot like I ask students to write their fears down or write their thoughts down. I didn't know that Krishnamurti has talked about that, but I think these really allow us to experiment with what Krishnamurti was saying and engage with learners in discovering what he meant by awareness or attention and the significance of it. Well, thank you so very much, Meenakshi. I think we will take up the questions and comments later on. So let's move on to our second keynote speaker, Dr. Ravi Ravindra. Are you ready to share your thoughts?
Yes, I can.
Thank you.
First of all, I should simply say that listening to Krishnaji was really like listening to Gandharva music or celestial music. It was difficult not to be inspired or touched by what he said. I first heard about Krishnamurti in 1964 from my fiancée, who was a Canadian citizen but had gone to India in 1961 as a volunteer. And she was, for whatever reason that I don't understand, she never understood it either, she was placed as a teacher in the Krishnamurti school at Rajghat. And there we had Achyut Patwardhan was at that time the rector of the school there. And he took slight pity on her because she was eating residential food coming from Canada, etc. She was getting weaker. So he more or less adopted her as his daughter. So when we got married and came to India in 1965, because I had heard about Krishnamurti from her, naturally I wanted to meet her. And of course, from Patwardhan's point of view, I was really like the son-in-law. And as everybody would know, especially in India, son-in-laws have a special importance, which is not true anywhere else in the world. So therefore, of course, he was very happy to arrange a meeting between me and Krishnamurti and set up a time. But about 10 days before that meeting in Varanasi, we were in Delhi. And it was Mrs. Kitty Shivarao who had actually taken my fiancé to become the volunteer. Now she was my wife. She needed to give some present to Mrs. Shivarao, and for whatever reason, she could not go. So she asked me to take it, and I went on a bicycle. So I came outside the large house of the Shivaraos, and somebody was sitting there like a chowkidar. And I asked this person, who was very striking. I kept looking at him and I was a bit surprised. I said, this Shivarao must be very, very wealthy to have such a grand chowkidar sitting there. And so I asked him if Mrs. Shivarao was inside. So he got up and went inside and said, she's not here yet, but if you wait for about half an hour, she'll be back. Of course, coming from Canada, one is always feeling a little rushed in time. So I did not wait, but I kept looking at this man. He seemed very remarkable to me, so much so that when I went away on my bicycle, I kept looking back at him and I ran into a woman who was carrying something on her head. So I fell down on the street. So 10 days later, I have this meeting with him and in Varanasi now. And about half an hour before the meeting, I was absolutely amazed how agitated I was. Going back and forth, very, very upset and agitated. And then something was very clear to me, like a clear self-perception, that the whole source of my agitation was that I wanted to impress Krishnamurti with my question, which in a way, just becoming aware of this freed me from that. And then something from, I still don't really understand from what depth or what place, something very deep inside me emerged, saying that even if the person I'm about to meet is a combination of the Buddha, Krishna, and Christ, still nobody can really seriously answer my inquiry. It has to be my own individual undertaking. And that so completely quietened me. Of course, as you all know, Krishnamurti was almost idée fixe about punctuality, which was necessary for him to show in India, particularly, where nobody is concerned about punctuality so much. So precisely at 4 o'clock, he opens the door and welcomes me in. By this time, I was so completely quiet. So he asked me, "What can I do for you?" I said, "Nothing. I just want to look at you." So we sat there on the same divan. He sat on one edge, I sat on the other edge, and we just kept looking at each other for at least 5 minutes. But then still he asked me, "What have I done in my life?" So I said to him, which was all true for me, that I have just finished a PhD in physics and people imagine that I'm an educated man, but I don't feel that I know anything really real, especially about myself. And he was very interested in what I just said. And then he, for a few minutes, spoke about the superficiality of all of this intellectual knowledge that we get in the universities, etc. And but then I felt I should really ask him some serious question. After all, here I'm taking his time. So I thought, trying to make up a serious question, really, I asked him, "What takes place after death?" And he said, "Why worry about death since you don't know anything about life?" Which was, which was actually true for me. Anyway, after about 20 minutes, we stood up and he took me to a window with his hand very much on my shoulder. And the Ganga was in full spate at that time. Dark clouds covering the sky. And there was a white bird which kept coming out of the dark clouds and would disappear. After a little while, Krishnaji said to me, "Life is just like that. Sometimes you see it, sometimes you don't." And then he gave me sort of a hug and he said, "I'm sure we'll see each other again." So that was my first meeting with Krishnamurti. And I was completely surprised to see that the person I had met as the Chaukidar was actually Krishnamurti. So I first met him not knowing who he was. And I was clearly struck by his presence. And I actually thought he was much taller than I was. But that was actually not true physically. But when I saw him first time, that was my impression. Very tall person, extremely self, really great presence. So much so that I kept looking at him. As I said, I fell down from my bicycle. So after that, we had really many meetings, and I will simply mention a few because they also raised certain issues that he was always emphasizing. For me, it was very clear that he was not any just usual person, but he had a bit of this very democratic style of saying he's just like everybody else, he would say, which was clearly not true. So on one occasion, I was especially sort of saying, "Krishnaji, we need to know your peculiarity about your whole structure of being." He said to me, this was a large audience, he said, "Do you think the speaker is a freak?" I said, "Yes." But you see, the word freak can mean something distorted, but it can also mean something unusual. In a way, whatever he said about everybody can be like him clearly was not true. He himself said at the end of his life that an energy of this kind will not enter into a body for hundreds of years. So, but in a way, he was trying to be very democratic about all this, saying everybody can be like him, which was obviously not true. He was very extraordinary, which he himself, as I said, acknowledged towards the end of his life. So on one occasion, more or less really as a scientific experiment, I asked him, there was a flower on the table where we were sitting, just two of us. I said, "Krishnaji, you look at this flower and describe to me how does your mind receive these impressions, and I will look at this And I will describe how I received it. So we sat there looking at this flower. Then he said, my mind is like a mill pond. An impression comes, slight wave arises, but very soon the whole thing is settled and quietness comes. Then he looked at me very mischievously, really, and said, and sir, your mind is like a mill, which was really true. In a way, one needs to see what is he pointing to, a stillness of the mind. Otherwise, one can look at the same flower, one would have a completely different impression, one would have a different understanding or relationship with the flower. And he very much used to emphasize this way of seeing things with a quieter and quieter mind. It is difficult for really anybody who looks at the situation on the planet right now not to realize that the planet is in great trouble. And some of these things are not really very new. Maybe the climate change is drastically now exaggerated or accelerating. But human beings throughout human history, as far as I can see, have been driven by fear and desire. Every spiritual teacher has remarked on it. And furthermore, what has also happened now, we have become so fascinated by external scientific knowledge, as if poetry, music, art, none of them can lead to any truth. Only science can lead to truth, which is conducted by usual externally oriented mind. Krishnaji was not against any of these things, but he was constantly reminding us of the necessity of a different kind of, one might say, knowledge or understanding. Essentially something which will lead to freedom from me, me, me. In fact, one of his remarks is, as long as I am, love is not. This was a fairly frequent expression of his, referring to whatever we mean by the highest reality as love, truth, and beauty. There would be three expressions he would often associate with subtlest level of reality. And then the suggestion that as long as I'm not free of myself, I cannot really experience that kind of truth or love or beauty. For that, the fundamental requirement is an impartial and steady self-inquiry. I don't personally remember him very much emphasizing this as a principle, but my own understanding is that the major principle at issue is that self-awareness is the mechanism of self-transformation. It's not that something else is going to change me. What will bring about any transformation in me, which is the essential requirement by all the great spiritual teachers, certainly, of course, by Krishnamurti, that I need to be internally transformed, essentially to be free of my usual ego-centered self, which is driving everybody in humanity, not only me. And that the mechanism for that is self-awareness. If I see the way I am, something in me will gradually change the way I am. That is really a fundamental principle. And that one does not then decide to do good. This was one thing which maybe I should even mention this as an example from, this is not my personal encounter, but Laura Huxley describes this in one of her descriptions. Some of you probably know that Aldous Huxley was quite a close friend of Krishnamurti, and Laura Huxley was really his second wife after Huxley. Then Aldous had passed away. Laura Huxley had a gathering at her place on one occasion. I gather 6 or 7 people were there, including Krishnamurti. And most of them were speaking about going around the world and doing good. And apparently, Krishnaji said, one should not be trying to do good. They were all very surprised. They said, well, you are going around the world doing good. He said, not intentionally. What was very important emphasis he tried to make, you don't try to do good. Goodness or love needs to ooze out of you. The expression that he frequently used, at least in my hearing, was a rose does not decide to smell like a rose. We recognize that it is a rose from its fragrance. So a person does not decide to do good. If one is at a certain level of being, some goodness, compassion, love will naturally ooze out of the person. Therefore, for somebody to say that the Buddha was enlightened but was not compassionate, it will be really an oxymoron. There can be no meaning to being enlightened unless compassion is oozing out of the person. Buddha doesn't decide to be compassionate. So I say that here especially, that compassion or love or sense of oneness or care for the others, care for our planet, it's not a matter of us deciding to do it. What is a fundamental requirement is that something in me is free of my usual self-occupied, self-centered self. Then any feeling for the goodness of the planet and for the others will naturally ooze out of one. So I will stop here now. If anybody wishes to raise a question or make a comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ravi Ravindra. That was really beautiful to hear of your personal meetings with Krishnamurti and your personal understanding of him. And I think that's absolutely true. Although we named this conference "Contemporary World Crisis," Krishnamurti has often said that the crises have always existed, and the crisis is in the psyche of the human beings, which is predominantly fear-driven and greed-driven. And what we see in the world today, especially as the capitalist and the Eurocentric world has become global, so I could say that the whole world is capitalist world at the moment. The significance of fear, significance of greed, significance of outer manifestations being good outwardly, no matter what happens inwardly, and there's just this whole superficiality, I think, has become really widespread. So the crisis that Krishnamurti has always talked about, I think, has deepened a lot. It's like, and COVID-19 has like clearly brought it out, right? Western countries running for vaccines for themselves without even realizing that unless everybody is vaccinated, your little security in your country is not sufficient. Unless everybody is safe and secure, nobody can stay safe and secure. So thank you for your remarks. We will take questions and comments after all the keynote speakers have spoken, just to maintain the regularity, if you don't mind.
That's fine.
Okay, Dr. Hilary Rodrigues, we are ready for you. Are you ready to share your remarks?
I am. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I want to thank Dr. Kumar and Dr. Acharya for organizing this, and the Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute for helping to support it, as well as Mount St. Vincent University. I'm not going to share with you a personal encounter with Krishnamurti. I was drawn to him by his teachings. And since I work in contemporary academia, unlike my two predecessor speakers here, I have a bit of a paper that I've written that I'd like to share with you. And I think it'll take 20 minutes, so it'll take up my time. I hope it's engaging enough as I read it, so that it doesn't feel like I'm just talking at you. And I hope I'm talking and conversing with you. So Krishnamurti spent most of his adult life giving discourses to small and large gatherings, and meticulously addressing the crises that face us globally and personally. When he was associated with the Theosophical Society in his youth, he gave his first public talk during World War I. His life spanned the First and Second World Wars, the Spanish flu epidemic that killed as many as 100 million people worldwide, the Holocaust, Indian independence, and the mass migrations and slaughter that ensued with partition. Not long before he died in 1986, the Cambodian genocide had claimed several million lives. Krishnamurti was certainly no stranger to these and countless other examples of horror that human beings have inflicted upon themselves and each other. Perhaps this is why Krishnamurti almost always began his discourses by pointing to the crises facing the world. In the very beginning of the last series of talks that he gave at San in Switzerland in 1985, just a year before his death, he said, and I quote, "We are concerned together with what is happening in the world, all the tragedies, the utter misery, poverty, and our responsibility to it." He continued by saying, quote, "The whole world is in a great state of crisis, and the crisis is not only out there, but also in each one of us. If you are aware of all of this, what is the responsibility for it on the part of each one of us? What is one to do?" One sees immediately that Krishnamurti draws a connection between the outer state of the world and each of us. We share a responsibility for the crises facing the world. Those words are poignantly relevant as we face such challenges as catastrophic climate change due to human-induced global warming, deadly drug addiction, and the tragic loss of life and livelihoods due to the COVID-19 global pandemic. Krishnamurti was well aware of the types of problems that face humanity, even if the specifics of those crises are unique to our times and circumstances. Nevertheless, he asserts quite clearly that the real problem is not out there, but in here. He put it quite bluntly in a public talk that he gave in Ojai, California in 1981, when he said again, I quote, "The crisis is not political, the crisis is not economic nor religious, but the crisis is in consciousness." That's the title of my talk. In our minds, in our hearts, in our brains, the crisis is there. And the politicians, however capable, and the scientists, the biologists, the microbiologists, and so on, they are not going to solve our problems. They have not. Krishnamurti suggests that to solve the crises that face us, we need to look at ourselves. Now, this may seem like a prescription for a self-centered, navel-gazing style of introspective analysis, grounded in a heavy regimen of self-improvement with negligible impact on the world around us. But this, I think, would be a misunderstanding of his teaching. So first, let me elaborate on the criticisms about Krishnamurti's teachings and his message. People sometimes contrast Krishnamurti to great figures, such as Guru Nanak, who founded the Sikh religion with millions of disciples, or to Mahatma Gandhi, whose social and political activism helped India to achieve independence from British rule. Moreover, Gandhi's approach of active, nonviolent resistance to oppression and injustice has been effectively used in the civil rights movement in South Africa, the United States, and so on. What did Krishnamurti's disciples ever do? Hold on, let me think for a moment. Nothing. Moreover, after more than half a century of teachings all around the world, Krishnamurti doesn't even have any disciples. And so his teachings do not appear to have made any difference in the world. Now, let me respond to those criticisms. For one, anyone who knows something about Krishnamurti's teachings understands that he doesn't have disciples because he didn't want disciples. So it's difficult to ascertain the impact that those who have resonated with his message have actually had on the world. Moreover, Krishnamurti did not advocate for joining Greenpeace or Amnesty International, fighting nonviolently, identifying with a race, a region, a religion, an ideology. In fact, he observed that sometimes the greatest successes in politics and religion come with a heavy price tag and eventually suffer from the internal rot of corruption. We do not need to look far back into history to see poignant evidence of Krishnamurti's observations. We simply need to look around the world today. How is it possible that the wealthiest and most technologically advanced country in the world has been incapable of an intelligent national response to a global pandemic? How is it possible that even with strong scientific data to support preventative measures, huge percentages of the world's population are reluctant to trust vaccines or wear face coverings to help stop the spread of an illness that might kill their fellow human beings? Why are large swaths of the population deliberate purveyors of lies and disinformation on their social media accounts about elections, scientific data, or about those who don't share their skin color, culture, or religious beliefs? Why are equally large swaths of the population deluded by such falsehoods? Why do 2,000 billionaires have as much wealth as the poorest 4 billion people, whose poverty causes 25,000 to die every day? Why? To Krishnamurti, the answers to these disturbing questions are not far away. These problems are not exclusively caused by the egocentric, megalomaniacal, greedy, dishonest, and exploitative sociopaths that we have elevated to the highest ranks of our societies, although that is certainly part of the problem. It's because we ourselves are complicit in the fear, greed, selfishness, anger, violence, and divisiveness that shapes our world. This is certainly one facet of Krishnamurti's dictum. You are the world. Now, you might be thinking to yourself that you're not truly responsible for these problems. After all, you're a vegetarian. You meticulously recycle. You make food bank donations, support LGBTQ values, and so on. The world's problems are substantively caused by others who are not like you. If you could get others to be like you, to embrace the sound values and behaviors that you have adopted, then the crises of the world caused by those other thoughtless, insensitive, and irrational persons would gradually be ameliorated. This, I believe, is where Krishnamurti's message is most subtle and most difficult to understand. For he implies that no matter how good we think we are not separate from the rest of humanity or of life itself. What is needed is a quality of observation that is not divisive. Only then is there the possibility of holistic and rational action in response to our problems. There's a deepening urgency to attend to this teaching, especially as our world fragments into competitive nationalisms, digital media-fueled micro-tribalisms, and personal alienation and isolation. Krishnamurti suggests that by being choicelessly aware of what is going on around us, but especially in our own heads and hearts, as we study, listen to the news, to teachers, to politicians, gurus, religious authorities, scientists, and so on, as we interact with the world, we are likely to understand our deep interconnectedness to the whole of reality. What is key in this teaching, and the point that's often misunderstood, is that interconnectedness is not an intellectually derived conclusion. One doesn't adopt the reasonable notion that we are interconnected and then try to act from that worldview. Such trying takes effort, causing you to judge yourself and others by what you think proper action should be, and fuels one's self-congratulation mechanisms and disparagement of others. Or alternately, and just as problematically, one judges oneself as a failure who cannot live up to a grand ideal. The division between you, the you that you think you are, and the you that you think you should be, is the matrix that generates time, judgment, fear, paralysis in action, anger, violence towards oneself and others, and a host of other problems. Krishnamurti urges us to embrace in this moment a quality of non-judgmental awareness, in a fearless freedom without the false security offered by clinging to outdated concepts and values. Life unfolds in new and mysterious ways. Yesterday, most of us could travel freely. We had jobs and livelihoods, and many of us had not lost a loved one. That's just one example, an obvious example of the new and changing realities presented by the global pandemic. Krishnamurti's teachings point us to a quality of consciousness that's always fresh, pliant, and responsive to the holistic truth of what is, not what should be or what could be, and certainly not to what was. This quality of consciousness he calls love and intelligence. It unfolds uniquely for each of us at each instant of our lives. It's not a cookie cutter solution to the world's crises that each of us needs to adopt or to convince others of adopting. Now, love and intelligence may seem like grand words and ideals, and they are, if they are misunderstood to be just words and ideals. They are not. They abide in a quality of our beings that is innocent and immaculate, simply allowing us to see the world and ourselves within it as we actually are, warts and all, as the expression goes. In this moment, as I give you my talk, am I worried about my appearance and the effectiveness of my Wi-Fi connection? Am I aware of my hope to convey correctly my understanding of Krishnamurti? Do I observe the despondency that all these words may not make a stitch of difference in addressing the crises that we face? But do I also recognize the hard work of the organizers and presenters in response to the crises we face? The remarkable work being done in Krishnamurti schools, and the value of joining with all these participants to think, talk about, and share our perceptions and concerns together. Love does not only embrace that which it deems lovable. Intelligence does not only attend to that which is intelligible. Quite the contrary, there's nothing outside their compass. Krishnamurti's message has a universal quality. It's not just for Indians, Canadians, or Americans, but for everyone. It addresses crises from the global to the personal, pointing to an unbroken unity between these two. It points us to the immediacy of the moment with a single operative invitation to look at the whole truth of this moment. The courage, honesty, and humility required for such observation does not need to be cultivated. It is the natural outcome of the awakening of love and intelligence when one sees the fact of our conditioned existences in action. It's not an invitation into a progressive path of action, a variety of moral or socially responsible behaviors to address our problems. It's an invitation to take the first step with freedom from the past, freedom from fossilized, ineffective approaches to our current problems. The first step then is the last step. It may sound paradoxical, But Krishnamurti observes that the action that derives from such a free and holistic observation of what is in this moment has as many creative possibilities as there are persons and moments. It will not likely produce a one-size-fits-all solution for everyone. It moves with the wisdom of uncertainty, leaving behind no trace like the flight of an eagle. These are but images to convey the quality of creative action that might flow in response to whatever crises we might face. If this all sounds too idealistic and not particularly pragmatic when it comes to facing such urgent issues as climate change, the global pandemic, one's ailing relationships, or one's declining health, it is. But Krishnamurti warns us that the idea is not the thing. His pointers are not about grand abstractions, but the day-to-day, moment-to-moment realities of our lives. One must begin and can only begin where one is. Something as simple as running out of milk makes me face a range of issues. Do I go out to get some? Should I wear a mask when I go out during this pandemic? What were the government advisories? Should I obey them? Interestingly, the COVID-19 virus offers an excellent example of how the actions of a single individual, me, might affect the entire world. What if I contract the virus and it mutates into a far more deadly strain within me, one capable of wreaking as much devastation as Ebola or smallpox or the Spanish flu? Okay, that's a bit extreme, isn't it? Or is it? Maybe I should just become a vegan and give up milk altogether. That would solve the issue. For one person, a response to the crises we face might be to implement a carbon tax on an entire nation and thereby risk political defeat in the next election. For another, it might be simply opting to wear a mask and getting a vaccination. It may mean saying a kind word of understanding to someone who doesn't share the same values as you, or observing how your own anger has affected yourself and those around you. In other words, I think one has misunderstood Krishnamurti if one thinks that he advocates a sort of introspection unrelated to action. Instead, he asks us to find out if there's an action that emerges without self-interest. For such action emanates instantly from love and intelligence. Put differently, Krishnamurti does not provide us with a solution. The constant inquiry is an open question. I'll give him the last words. Love is total responsibility to the whole of life. Not only your life, but the other's life. I say that love is the total answer. Without intelligence, you cannot have the other, love. They are inseparable. And that is why compassion, by that he means love, has this quality of great intelligence. And that is the solution which will solve all our problems. End quote. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilary. That was very very motivating, very insightful remarks. I think one thing that you pointed out, I think a lot of people get confused about that. A lot of people think Krishnamurti is idealistic, overly philosophical, has no connection to the everyday life, and there can't be nothing more unreal than that, because the whole focus of Krishnamurti is to become awakened in the everyday life. But I think people find that very difficult. It's easy to become part of a cause or have a ideology, Marxist ideology, and pursue that. It's always easy to have to let your brain be concentrated on a particular thing and then follow it without being totally aware of your day-to-day moment. So you can talk about love and compassion, but in your personal life or the way you do things can be very harsh. or can be very, like people like it has happened in the name of religions. How many people have been butchered, how many people have been killed. The world wars were fought to bring about the good, and and to make the world a better place. So I think for those who are attending, and I think Hillary's talk made it very clear that what Krishnamurti is talking about is very existential and pragmatic and is connected to everyday life. He's talking about the transformation of the very moment that one is living. And that is very difficult because you have to awaken your intelligence. And that can never be awakened unless we uh, are aware not only of ourselves but of the world and our relationship to each other. So it's not that the being critical of the oppression in the world is out of what Krishnamurti is talking about. If you see, that's how he starts all of his talks. He's very critical and very upset about what happened in the world, but he's bringing you to the very source from which this chaos is coming out, which we are, as he used to say, unwilling to accept. We are unwilling to accept that we are the cause of this chaos, not a particular group or not a particular person who you can point to. So thank you very much, Neha. Is it open to question now? Okay, you said that, right? So everybody, now you can share your questions and comments for the speaker via a chat. So Meenakshi, Ravi, and Hillary, you could also see those questions. And if there is something that you would like to respond to, please go ahead. I can try to read certain things. So Sagar says, "What a treat it was to listen to all of them. Often wonder what K would have thought said, seeing today's world crisis around us. Have these teachings just gone into the black hole with no transformation of human consciousness? Any thoughts?" I think we just talked about it, but anybody would like to share their thoughts? Any of you?
Why do we say that we've gone into the black hole of consciousness? What is that the quote? Is it?
Yeah.
Black hole
Have
with
this
no
teaching just gone
black
into the
hole
black hole with no
with no
transformation of?
transformation of consciousness. I see Krishnamurti's work in education and the engagement in all his schools all over the world. I don't see it as having gone into a black hole. We are working with children every day, with young minds, and I would not like to see that as not being or having the potential for change. The moment we think that there is the possibility of change is limited uh, by circumstances or context or whatever is happening around us, I think we are putting brakes on ourselves. So I, for myself at least, I see that Krishnamurti's work in education is in process. It's a continuous process, and it's certainly not uh, gone into black hole. And also that every young person who is, whether in the schools or outside the schools, as some of my co-presenters have shared their own lives, or myself as a young person, there is an engagement which takes place. There is a change that takes place. Ashwani has not even met Krishnamurti, but has come across Krishnamurti in much later. So I would not like to have such a dismal view of things, if I may say so. Thank you.
Hillary and Dr. Ravi, Ravindra, would you like to respond to this question?
No, I think what Meenakshi has said is really very relevant. There is no need for me to add anything to this now. I have personally met, I would say, perhaps more people in my life who have been touched, and whatever I understand, by their inner freedom, by the teaching of Krishnamurti than perhaps any other teaching that I have come across. So that is, but to imagine that everybody in human history or the whole planet, 7.5 billion people will be transformed, is imagining too crazily. I don't think that will ever happen. But it influences some people and definitely has influenced some people, which then in its turn brings about other changes.
And I would say, I think one point that I would like to emphasize, sorry here, that Krishnamurti always referred to himself as K. There was a time that he wouldn't let his pictures be taken or videos be recorded. So you would see very clearly Krishnamurti was very aware that he doesn't want him to be the priority. So that's why he would always say, work with the teaching, experiment with the teaching, forget me, I am not important. So that's what we are that's what we are trying to do. We are seeing what is the significance of what he said, not necessarily who he was. Hillary, anything you would like to say? You are muted.
Please unmute yourself, Hillary.
I was simply practicing silence. Supposed to be a good thing. You know, I didn't share my encounter with Krishnamurti, but my encounter started with reading his stuff, and I didn't read him by hearing that he was a good person to read and so on. I've written about this in some other places, like the Journal for the Krishnamurti Schools and so on, where I was reading other things. I became interested in sort of spiritual realization and so on. And I'd see these books by Krishnamurti in the bookstore, and I was like, oh, that guy's an Indian. I'm not going to get all enamored by some Indian guru, you know, who has something to teach. So I didn't want to read Krishnamurti because I felt that people in the West were, you know, re-listening to the Maharishi and this and that. But finally, I ran out of things to read, and I picked up a Krishnamurti book, and I just wanted to tear it apart. That was really the attitude that I had reading my first book by Krishnamurti. And as I read it, he totally disarmed me by what he had to say. He said, you know, don't listen blindly to what I'm saying. Don't, you know, and I had a kind of a scientist's attitude to things. I was a science student, and I immediately liked this. He said, don't follow me or anybody else blindly. I liked it. I read just a few things, and I started to try to put into practice not what he said, because I resonated with his message. His message was discover the truth through living life. So, you know, but nevertheless, I kind of liked his message. So I was drawn to the man by the quality of his words. And when I was traveling in India as a seeker, a backpacker, I heard that Krishnamurti would be giving talks in Varanasi. I was in Manali, I made my way down, but I got there late, like a few days into his talk, and that happened to be he was unwell and he canceled his talks. So I missed out seeing him. I went to the Theosophical Society, the local branch in Varanasi, and they said, oh yeah, it's too bad. He's not well. He's canceled his remaining talks. But if you go right now up to Rajghat, you might see him get in his car to go to the airport. And when I heard that, it suddenly, I was shocked. I said, why would I want to see this guy get in his car? I realized that people had a kind of a guru affection for Krishnamurti, that just darshan of him would be enough. And in some strange way, it freed me from Krishnamurti at that moment, because I felt, why do I even want to see this guy? I've been reading what he's been saying. I like what he says. I'm trying to live what he is saying, not go and listen to him talk and say the same things over and over and over again to me. So that was kind of a wonderful experience of being freed from the man rather than the essence of his teachings. Then some years later, utterly coincidentally, I happened to be in Santa Barbara, and some friends told me, oh, you know this guy Krishnamurti and so on. And I was accidentally taken up to Ojai, to the Oak Grove, where I heard him speak. So my encounters with Krishnamurti have been in some strange way spontaneous and less tied to him. Now, of course, he had an extraordinary charisma as I learned more about his life and so on. It's quite extraordinary. But for me, the core is really the message that he has for us. You know, that's the thing that I think is, and I hope that that continues to live on, but it lives on people think about this black hole and that, oh, did people get it and not get it and so on. The message is the key, and it's the message that each of us needs to recognize, internalize, not as something that we take as an authoritative truth, but something that is a pointer for us to discover for ourselves.
Uh, uh, well, I can read one question and then Neha, you can pick another question. So somebody is asking Kelly Young, what kind of holistic approaches could people use to save themselves after experiencing or during disasters, especially if their health has been affected seriously? Uh, would somebody like to say anything to that? Any response to that? There is a question for Hillary. Is compassion only a psychological response? How do we all inculcate it? Bharat by Bharat Jobanputra.
I don't. I think if you put the word, if you apply a label to whether it's psychological or physical and so on, you're again partitioning what we are, which is we are fundamentally holistic entities that are interconnected to things. Our emotional, physical beings are all interconnected. So there's a seamless response. My personal sense is that, if something hurts you without thinking, you reach to rub it, to tend to it. When there's suffering, that there's awareness of that suffering, there's a response to it. How one responds or what one does is based on one's capacity at that moment. If I'm, physically able to respond in some way and so on. Compassion or love is merely a response in the face of what arises in life. And sometimes it's a psychological realization, perhaps. Sometimes it's a physical response. There is no one way it can be. It merely is, and it occurs when there is not necessarily a self impeding its response. I've sometimes thought that there's this distinction between pity and compassion or love. Pity has you pitying some other individual and acting accordingly, like going and doing something. Compassion is there when there is no self, there's no other, there is no you to be compassionate towards. There's only a response in the face of something problematic, right? In the face of sorrow, compassion acts without people getting in the way.
Laurie Cook says, think Krishnamurti's influence lives on in the various peoples who have been struck by his work and continues to live and grow as more people and from more diverse background learn about his work. So there are a lot of questions here. As some people, including kids and adults, are committing suicide during pandemic, I want to know, as an educator, what kind of assistance could we provide to those who have no chances to go to hospital and see psychologist? I'm just reading it out. If anybody has a response, I can wait for a minute or move forward.
Sorry, please go ahead. Nahi, please, aap boliye.
No, I was just simply going to say my own impression is that despair that leads to, for some people, to suicide or to excessive drinking or one thing or the other, usually, at least in my own impression and experience, is that somehow nobody is listening to them. So if I were to even suggest something, that maybe the parents of these people, or if they have uncles or aunts or teachers, just to listen to them can actually considerably free them of the great anguish that leads to despair. This is certainly my own impression. I think one of the things, in a way, as was very much emphasized by Hillary also, Krishnamurti would say, even listening, one needs to be also aware of who in me is listening and how am I listening. But to undertake this as some kind of a project, just as an external idea, that's not proper listening. But to actually participate in their suffering, literally, that's almost the root of the word compassion, to suffer with the other person. That's the root of the very word, compassion.
Meenakshi, you want to share something?
No, I just agree with you. You've explained it so beautifully. And that I was going to say the same thing somewhat differently, to dialogue with that person, to engage that person, talk to them, because that is how the person will be able to unburden or, reflect on his or her own suffering. And that comes out of compassion. So to have compassion as the basis, but we tend to not necessarily work through compassion always, but through, in a very pragmatic sense, deal with issues piecemeal. In fact, we need to deal with issues in a holistic manner. Krishnaji used to always say, keep the big picture in mind. We can't address the issue in just what is that person may be experiencing at that particular moment. The trigger, the pandemic or a particular situation is just the trigger. There is a whole thing, everything else that is going on simultaneously. And talking would help in unraveling that.
There is Chian Wan Yu. She's a professor at Mount St. Vincent University. She asks, the notion of love and intelligence is very much aligned with the Buddhist notion of compassion and wisdom. I'm not familiar with K's religious inclination, but he seems to be a Hindu. I think this is a good question to clarify, so that's why I'm bringing it up. What would you comment on the essential difference between commonality between Hinduism and Buddhism? Are these two religions essentially point to the same truth?
One very well-known scholar, T.R.V. Murthy, who wrote also a very important text actually on Buddhism. I was studying with him in 1978, and on one occasion he said to me, Buddhism is Hinduism for export. Because Hinduism, even the word Hindu is not an Indian word. It is mostly geographically oriented population. But Buddhism, as it went out of that geographical limitation, essentially really carries the heart of Hinduism. One doesn't have to necessarily agree or disagree with what he was saying, but there is a great deal of truth in this. So many things are very common, but there are also gradually, especially as Buddhism then went to China, from there to Korea, Japan, etc., it naturally encountered other great cultures, and that also has slightly changed it. So there are certain differences one can point to, but there are many, many common things between so-called Hinduism and Buddhism.
Hilary, you might want to speak to that question as well, given you are a professor of religious studies.
I think I could go on for semesters on. But I think at the core of the question, the terms Hinduism and Buddhism are applied to socio-cultural, historical processes, groups of people, and so on. But both systems value moksha, or liberation. And at the core, their highest value is liberation from what? Liberation from something that dilutes us, something that, sometimes it's samsara, maya. It's about liberation from falsehood to the truth of what we are, what reality is. But the mechanism of falsehood, the mechanism that keeps us lost and deluded, is something that's also part of this reality. It's what keeps us separated. It's what keeps us afraid. It keeps us bound. It keeps us isolated. And in a way, both traditions, if you like, are pointing to coming free of that. Now, over time, there are accretions, and they've argued with each other and bickered, and there are philosophical debates and so on. But if you think that this idea of getting free of falsehood to the truth about who you are and what life is important, then whether you're a Buddhist or a Hindu and so on doesn't really matter, because you're more interested not in the label, but in really trying to discover whether this is possible, whether it is possible to be free from delusion, self-delusion, delusion about others. And I mean, much of life, I mean, a lot of the questions that I'm seeing here asked in the chat room is, what do we do? Krishnamurti's answer to that, is not to give you an answer. He doesn't say, look, here's what you should be doing. In a way, what he does say is, bring yourself to that situation with vulnerability in some sense, with honesty, with the humility, with the quality of openness. If you can come there as if you don't know the answer, right, then that question, your honest engagement with that question, which is facing you, the conundrum of life, the mystery of life, that opens, cracks the shell open and frees you to the possibility of maybe a never-ending answer. Someone asked if there's a finality to this process. The idea of an end or a process stops to be relevant. That's another distinction that your mind is making. Will I ever get there? Will I ever be fully enlightened? Will I ever fully, we always split things up into this and that, right? And in the vulnerability of this moment and the openness of your heart and mind to this moment, everything is ended. Time ends, process ends, and not knowing is the way. That's kind of the point that I was getting at. It's not coming to a conclusion about the way things are. It's a vulnerable openness to the possibility, the creative possibility, the creative unfolding of this moment, which you are indeed a part of. You are it, in fact. There is no you looking at this moment and trying to figure it out and so on, right? You are this mystery unfolding in front of your eyes.
I think that was questioned by Adrian Downey. He's also a professor at the Mount, where he was asking that was it possible, like what's the end of continuously peeling your conditioning and going at the end? Well, Krishnamurti does say that there is a beyond, or there is a ground of being. But again, Krishnamurti also in the same way says that if your focus is on the ground or the being, that is the projection of the mind or the greed of the mind that it wants it. So and that's why he just brings it back as to continual awareness. It's a never ending river, and perhaps there is no end to it, but or the beginning is the very end, as he has often said that. So there is another question: how do we
I actually
ensure?
thought maybe I
Yeah.
could just jump in, because some people
Yeah,
are
please.
direct messaging me, so I don't want to exclude them. But
Please.
there's also a question that I think a number of other subsequent questions have the same theme. So this is from Michael Fisher. He has asked, I have always found Krishnamurti's analysis of knowledge and self as dependent on analysis of fear. Do we need a better fear education, where fear is not merely an emotion like all others? So I think, in other words, is there something special or particularly significant about fear that we should shed light on?
Meenakshi, you might be able to respond to that question.
Fear, as I said when I was speaking earlier, the fear actually does not allow us to interact, to engage, to learn, to understand, because one is actually trapped in in a context in which which may be due to my imagination or due to my emotions. I'm sort of trapped, and that paralyzes me. Krishnaji used to link it, or often use the analogy of when you see a snake or a cobra, and there is that fear, but how do you deal with that fear? Do you just sit there or keep looking at the cobra, or you try to do something about it? So I think if we can look at fear in the same way, as a psychological, I'm not saying this, perhaps Hillary might be better able to answer this, but I just feel that fear is at the crux of much of our interaction. And unless we can do away with everything that creates that fear or generates that fear, we cannot have a meeting point. I don't know if I'm making myself clear that for any educational process, for example, to be actually successful, we cannot work in an environment or an engagement through fear, which is often the case without even knowing it. Some questions were about higher education, and in higher education also, I think even much more in India, of course, in mainstream schools, the authoritarianism and all of that hierarchy is much more, but in higher education, it's even greater. I know many of, Ashwani and Nayha would probably know this very well, that the professor, the world of academia, where you need to constantly move up the ladder, you need to perform in a certain way. In India, it's also now come down to certain scores that young assistant professors have to get, what they call them API scores. There's a lot of, they're working in an environment of fear. So where is the learning taking place? I am all the time, if I'm a professor, thankfully I'm no longer am in the university, my main concern would be, how do I keep moving ahead so that I don't lose out in this race? And so how am I going to, some of the questions were, how do we deal with the social and emotional needs of young people in universities? How am I going to deal with them? If I'm myself trapped in this whole process of, dealing with fear, my own fears about being left out, of not being successful. And frankly, if I think, I know it's easy for me to say that, perhaps because I am in a position of privilege, I always should be cautious and conscious of that. But frankly, throughout my career in the university, I simply didn't care. It was not considered politically correct to be working on Krishnamurti. That's the first thing I want to say in academia. It was not politically correct to be working on Krishnamurti, that too in the context of education, which is anyway at the bottom rung of sociology, which was my discipline. So, and I was often admonished by others, my senior professors and mentors, one might say, that look, you're not going to go very far in this. I didn't care. You must do what you want to do. And there's very little time. As a Buddhist teacher has said, life is just a wave of the hand, right? If we just simply sit back and give in to our, experience of fear, and that let our whole trajectory or life trajectory be shaped by that, then one is trapped. So I know as some people might think that, yes, not just some people, it is true that if I want to earn a livelihood, then I perhaps need to be following the straight and narrow path and not being able to, say that I can go this way or that way. But I think one has to deal with that. Only then one can deal with other people. You can, if you only within yourself, if you first grappled with this, can you deal with, others, whether they're your students or other people around you? Can you then deal with the understanding their fear or engaging with them even in a dialogue about fear? How do we engage if I cannot first look at my own fear and understand it? Sorry, I'm taking so long.
I think that was a very good comment, Meenakshi. I think that was a question from Michael Fisher, and he was saying, because in Krishnamurti's thinking, fear is such an important part, should there be like a fear education? See, Krishnamurti was also used to say, as Meenakshi was describing so well, that the psychological structure of the society is corrupt. So there is fear, there is becoming, there is conditioning. Everything we do, there is like we may have to reflect back very carefully. It may not be our inner impulse or a real thirst for something that we are doing. We may be completely bombarded by social pressures. Now, when I was a student in India, in geography honors, I used to love my professors. I used to think, wow, they have so much freedom. They come, they teach, and they are meeting the students outside in the D school cafeteria, and that was so good. But now when I see back, we are simply copying the West by creating all those structures, and like how many conference presentations you have to do, how many papers, and there is so much mediocrity that is coming up. So we have suffered so much because of that here. And in West, I think it is very difficult to explain, because the whole the whole foundation of the structure here is self progress. And it can appear in self into doing the welfare of the society, but it's basically about the progress of the self, advancing the self. And that is becoming very prominent in India and all the other countries of the world, because I think after colonization, we are going after what West is doing, what is good education, what is good higher education, and all these rankings between so many things. It's very problematic. So what I was saying to you, Michael Fisher, I think Krishnamurti emphasized that there has to be an education of the psyche along with any other education, and fear is an important part. So we need to really focus on fear and all other problems of the psychological structure that are part of us and part of the society. Sorry, I'm taking some time because I'm supposed to be the session chair, so I need to say a few things as well, so that I can keep the things going. But we are very close to the time, so maybe last word of wisdom, something that Hilary and Dr. Ravi Ravindra and Dr. Meenakshi Thapan, would you like to conclude by just sharing one thought or comment from your side? And anybody can go.
Well, based on both the remarks of yourself as well as of Meenakshi, it is important to see the very close relationship between fear and desire. They are not separated from each other. Fear actually largely arises that my desires may not be fulfilled. So I would simply suggest to you not to separate these two. If one is looking at oneself, sometimes it's better to look at what is it that I'm trying to accomplish or achieve or wishing for. Then the fear can be a consequence of that. Thank you very much.
And why do I want that? Has it been put into my head by somebody that I really needed? Hilary, would you like to say something?
Based on what said, I'll use something that Krishnamurti didn't talk about, but they used in Buddhism. You know, the Buddhist consciousness is often kind of, the symbol is a lotus flower, and a lotus grows out of a mucky pond. The mucky pond is a filthy mess, but the lotus blossoms completely immaculate. The dirt kind of falls away. And the Buddhists say that you need that mess, you need that mucky context for the lotus to grow from. You know, we are a mess. Our conditioned selves are fearful, desirous, all those things that we look out and say is so terrible about the educational institutions we're in, and so on. We are complicit in some sense in it. We're both victims and agents. And the only way this can transform is if we work at understanding how those processes play out within us in these contexts. There's the possibility of change by changing oneself, but changing oneself not as an idea, but in response, a sensitive, vulnerable response to what's going on at the moment. So, you know, it's never a satisfactory type of answer, the solution, but there it is. You know, we're being pointed to the mess of the world that we are in as being as almost being necessary for this transformation to occur. Perhaps it never will ever not get messy. And maybe that doesn't matter. You know, that is not an optimistic type of answer. But maybe we don't want optimism, we want realism.
Meenakshi?
No, I just want to not respond to, because I think there's no time, but I just want to say something in response to one of the questions that was posed about by, I think, Gopal Krishnamurti on, because I would like to also share my vulnerability. I don't think I would like to be seen as a speaker here who knows everything about Krishnamurti. I certainly don't. And, you know, that one is at a different level or different stage. So the question is about what are one's own, what are the unanswered questions that are left in one's lives, having known and worked on Krishnamurti all these years. And I think I would just like to say about myself, certainly, is the feeling, the difficulty of attachment, you know, of letting go, of being able to let go. Because as one
Nope.
She might have lost her internet.
no, it's there.
Oh, yeah. Sorry,
Yeah,
your picture froze for a moment.
Okay. No, I was just saying that the sense of attachment that one has, whether it's to one's work, whether it's to one's writing, whether it's to one's loved ones, whether it's to loss of parents, older generation, that sense of attachment, how does one let go of that? I'm still grappling with that. Yeah, perhaps.
Thank you. Well, I think we are a little bit over time, so I would like to conclude this session. Thank you so much, Dr. Meenakshi Thapan, Ravi Ravindra, and Hilary Rodrigues. It was really fruitful discussion, and from the chat message, it seems that the folks have enjoyed it. So we are going to conclude the first session of the conference. Tomorrow we meet again at 11 a.m. Atlantic Standard Time and 8:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time, and we will hear from Dr. Ashutosh Kalsi and Dr. Mukesh Gupta. And I think it will be a really fascinating discussion. So please do come and join us. Neha, anything else? Okay. All right, everybody. You can keep sharing your messages in the chat. We will look at it. And others, please feel free to log out, and see you tomorrow.
Thank you, everyone.
I just did one quick thing. Somebody was asking Hillary for the paper that you had read. So if you're willing and able to share it, we can email it out to participants or individuals.
Absolutely. I'll send you a copy of it.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Meenakshi.
Thanks,
Thank
Meenakshi.
you, Hillary.
See you. Oh, is she frozen again?
I think, yeah, her picture froze again, yeah.
I was hoping to say hello a bit more, but maybe another.
She might come back in a minute.
Might come back, you never know, yeah.
Yeah.